Hi guys, so obviously this video is a continuation of yesterday's when we were looking at London and Ozymandias. Hopefully in the last session you sort of were able to write a summary of the poems and you have a good understanding of the poems. What we're going to try and do today is continue to work with those poems and continue to practice writing about them. 3 words that will be useful to you later in this session. 3 words you've probably already encountered in class, but I just want to make sure that you remember them. Transience, hubris and irony. Firstly, transience means something that's lasting only a short time. So transience is a noun. We can use it as an adjective, transient. If we say something is transient, it's a transient weather front. It's only going to last a short time, okay? Hubris means excessive pride or self-confidence. Again, it's a noun. You can use it as an adjective, hubristic. He was a hubristic character, would suggest somebody was excessively self-confident or proud. And then irony is quite a complex concept. I'm talking about situational irony in this case, but irony in this context means when an outcome or event the outcome or event contradicts what was expected, okay? So if you expect one thing to happen, but then something else happens, we can call that irony, okay? So all of these words relate to the poem Ozymandias. So all I'd like to do is to decide which word fits in each gap. The words Ozymandias chose to have on the pedal of the statue suggest his, and then you decide if transience, hubris or irony goes in that gap. However, there is clear something, because he intended the statue as a symbol of his internal power, but it has been destroyed by nature and time. This indicates the something of human power. So just decide which of those 3 words goes in each gap, please. Excellent. So I'll quickly go through the answers, and you can self-assess. The first one is his hubris. The words Ozymandias chose to have on this pedestal statue says his hubris. The words are, "Look on my work, ye mighty, and despair." So clearly he has excessively proud and self-confident. However, there is clear irony, because he intended the statue as a symbol of his eternal power, but it's been destroyed by nature and time. So what he intended and the actual outcome are different. This indicates the transience of human power, that actually, even though he thought he was incredibly powerful and important, human power is only ever short-lived. Okay, what I'd like us to move on to now is GST. And if you remember, GST stands for General Specific Thesis, and I've presented to you this before as a great way to write the introduction to an essay. So in your exam, when you get asked to do an essay question on the poems, a great way to start is a 3-sentence introduction that says something general, something specific, and then a thesis statement. The complication is that the exam task for poetry will be comparative, so I will have to show you at a later date how to use this structure in a comparative way, but we're going to practice it just on single poems to start. So I'm going to model writing a GST paragraph about the poem London, and then I'd like you to write a GST paragraph about the poem Ozymandias. And we're writing our paragraphs in response to this question: how does Blake present ideas about power in London? So I'm going to write a general sentence about the poem, I'm going to say something more specific about the poem, and then I'm going to offer a thesis statement which really answers the question. So I'm going to say, in London, Blake presents a city that is oppressive, bleak and miserable. Okay, so I think that's about as general as you can get, really, isn't it? That I've just used a list of 3 to set an overview. In summary, he presents us a city that's oppressive, bleak and miserable. And that's fine, because my first sentence is meant to be general, so now I can be more specific. Okay, so I'm going to say, the narrator of the poem wanders through the streets, and everywhere he goes. I've said he, but really we don't know it's a male narrator, because it's a male poet, I kind of gone with he. He is confronted by signs of helplessness. Actually, I'm going to change signs to sights and sounds that indicate helplessness and human suffering. So, in London, Blake presents a city that is oppressive, bleak and miserable. The narrator of the poem wanders through the streets, and everywhere he goes he is confronted by sights and sound that indicate helplessness and human suffering. Okay, so I've said something more specific now, haven't I? That it's not going into great depth about the poem, but I'm giving some sense of an overview. So now I want to give my thesis sentence. So I really want to get into this kind of crux of the question about power. And so I want to talk about the fact that juxtaposed with those images of suffering, so juxtaposed just means put next to, are the institutions, the church and the monarchy, that should be protecting people but aren't. So I'll say juxtaposed with these images of human suffering are institutions of power, the church and palace, and I've just put those words in quotation marks because they're actual words from the poem, that should protect the people but are presented by Blake as morally corrupt and failing. Okay, so just correct a typo there. Institutions. So we've now got a GST opening. In London, Blake presents a city that is oppressive, bleak and miserable. The narrator of the poem wanders through the streets, and everywhere he goes he is confronted by sights and sounds that indicate helplessness and human suffering. Juxtaposed with these images of human suffering are institutions of power, the church and the palace, that should protect the people, but are presented by Blake as morally corrupt and failing. I think I need to add over here though, in order to expose the neglect of the poor. Okay, we need that last bit in order to, because if we're going to be saying why he's doing it, that's always going to get us that higher marks. So just adding that little bit on shows we're thinking about not just what he shows us, but why he shows us it, immediately helps us to get off to a stronger start. So I'd just like to read that back through to check I'm happy with it. In London, Blake presents a city that is oppressive, bleak and miserable. The narrator of the poem wanders through the streets, and everywhere he goes he is confronted by sights and sounds that indicate helplessness and human suffering. Juxtaposed with these images of human suffering are institutions of power, the church and the palace, that should protect the people, but are presented by Blake as morally corrupt and failing in order to expose the neglect of the poor. I'm happy with that. It's only an introduction. I think I've got to the crux of the poem, and all I've done here really is introduce ideas I'm going to go on to prove. So when I come back to write other paragraphs of my essay, I'm going to pick up on these ideas again and prove I'm right. So I'm just setting up a sort of insightful overview at this stage. Okay, so can you try exactly the same thing for Ozymandias? How does Shelley present ideas about power in Ozymandias? So exactly the same, try to write a general sentence that sums up the whole poem. Something more specific that goes into more detail about the content of the poem, and then a final sentence which is really a why sentence that moves away from explaining the content of the poem to the big ideas of the poem. Thanks very much, guys.